Yo, welcome to The Noob and the Knower. In this podcast, we pair a driven beginner with a seasoned vet to explain how to learn basically anything.
This season's anything is how to fly fish. Stick around as we cover the gamut, 101 to the 401, gear, reading water, fishing techniques, and much, much more.
With star of hit video series Modern Nymphing, Fly Fishing Team USA medalist, and professional guide Lance Egan.
That's right. And here co-hosting and asking the questions on your behalf is avid fly fisher and recently graduated noob, Pablo Signori.
So let's go. Together we'll take you from fishing zero
to fly angling hero faster than you can say, fish on.
Welcome, everybody. We are back again. The Noob and the Knower podcast, Fly Fishing Edition, Season 1, Episode 6. We are here with Ray Bly.
What's up, what's up?
And Mr. Lance Egan.
Hello, hello.
We are talking today about flies. We're going to talk about what flies you should use and when. This is something that people spend a lot of time thinking about, probably too much time, but it definitely deserves its own little thing. And I actually wanted to start this podcast with this story of something that happened to me this weekend, which was nuts, and I would love to have your guys' opinions on it. I've been keeping this story close to my chest because it's too good, and I didn't want to spoil it for all our listeners and for Lance and Ray. So I was in Pennsylvania this weekend for Memorial Day, and I was fishing with my brother on this creek that's behind my sister's house. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us because she was attending to the guests, but we were able to sneak away for a second, and I decided to fish dry dropper. I gave my brother kind of like the faster water up top, and I went down to this kind of slower water, and there was obviously some sort of hatch going on. I saw that there was mayflies, like size 14, whitish color, flying around, whatever. I was like, okay. I'm going to fish a dry dropper and see what happens. And I put on an Elk caddis, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which I guess I should have put a mayfly pattern on, but I did also see some caddis, so I wasn't totally crazy. And I just love that fly anyhow. But anyway, so I cast out, and a lot of times when you're on a river, there's a whole world out there. So it's not just the fish. When you start paying attention, you'll start seeing all sorts of stuff. And of course, there are birds that eat insects too. So there was a bunch of sparrows that were like crash diving, doing their like crazy fighter jet flights all over the place, picking up these hatching insects. And at a certain point, I'm sitting there fishing, and this bird comes down and picks up my fly. Has this happened to you guys?
Was it an African swallow?
I'm not quite sure. It was insane. Has this happened to you guys before?
Yes, many time.
Okay.
They will pick off your fly often in rivers and lakes, but more often in rivers. And it happened to me probably 10 times last week on a stonefly hatch. We were fishing, and we throw a dry fly tight to the bank, and a bird would swoop down from the trees and try and pick it off. And half the time you'd have to skate it away from them so they wouldn't pick it up.
That's crazy.
Wow.
Well, I didn't realize that he was actually going to grab it.
Those are big stoneflies. The bigger the insect, the more likely that is to happen. Like a little tiny blue-wing olive, not likely to happen. But when you start getting 14, 12, 10, and bigger size stuff, they'll pick them off right off the surface.
It was a 14.
Yeah, that's on the border.
And she came in there. She just picked it up. And what's crazy is I had a dropper on this thing. So I was like, is it not feeling it? I thought that later. In the moment, I was like,
Oh my God.
Just wondering why you let it go that far before you...
Because I was freaking out. I was paralyzed. I was like, what? How is this happening? This is insane. I wiggled the tip of the rod, and it just dropped it. It knew right away. And I was like, oh my God. So I looked upstream to my brother, and I was like,
Dude, a bird just grabbed my fly. Oh my God.
And that's my story.
That's a cool story. We always tease that, you got the pattern dialed if you got the birds. The birds are picking it off the water.
That was a home tie, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk about fly tying later, and that was a home tie.
Ooh. That must have been a dumb African swallow.
It was pretty dumb. My home ties are not that good. All right, so that's my little intro story for you listeners out there, and those are the joys of fishing nice flies, I guess.
So to be clear, you did not hook the bird.
I did not. I would have been mortified. I really would have. I would have been. So let's talk about flies. First and foremost, we talked about this earlier. I can't remember which podcast it was, but it was one of the earlier ones. We talked about, what is a fly, right?
Okay.
And I said it was anything at the end of your leader or tippet, fly line, leader, tippet, just to remind all the noobs out there. At the end of that, there's something, and that's your fly. Would you guys agree with me on that one?
100%.
Okay.
Yeah, that's, I mean, maybe within some parameters of, like a tube jig, not a fly.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
A lure or Rapala type thing, not a fly. But yeah, something that somebody has hand tied and attached materials, whether they be synthetic or natural type materials to a hook with thread, I would call that a fly.
Okay, so you're saying, like, if you took a Rapala and you put it at the end of your fly rod, it's not a fly. That's what you're saying?
Unless you hand build your Rapala with thread instead of balsa wood, then perhaps.
Okay, fair.
Then it's not a Rapala, right? Then it's
that's true.
Then it's a game changer, or it's
Ooh. Game Changer is a very famous fly, ladies and gentlemen. It's a newer fly, which we're going to talk about new versus classic and all sorts of stuff coming up here. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're good. That was it. I mean, I guess I hesitate to say anything attached to the end as a fly, because not anything is a fly.
Okay.
I don't know where you guys are, maybe not so much, but around here you get all kinds of stuff getting attached to fly rods, flatfish and that kind of stuff trolling in lakes that it doesn't matter to me. I don't care what people call it. It's just fishing, whether it's fly fishing or not, but it's not a fly. I would say it's a lure. You're fishing on a fly rod.
Okay, that's fair. I'm glad you clarified that, because that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I kind of want to touch a little bit on, like, what makes these flies interesting is that we use kind of, well, traditionally and still now, but there's the kind of, like, they call it the golden age of fly tying, but it's because there's a bunch of materials that were previously not available to us. But let's talk a little bit about these materials that are used to make these flies. It's mainly like fur, feathers, and then some synthetics nowadays, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hooks, high carbon steel hooks.
Okay.
Most of the time nylon thread, occasionally gel spun thread.
I make my own hooks with bird bones, but
yeah, with 100% illegal whale bone.
Yeah, exactly.
Your brand is the Verticoli, no doubt.
Yeah, black rhino femur.
Well, that's next level for sure, folks. Don't think you have to do that one at home.
So yeah, you got that. What else we got on these flies?
Like you mentioned, various natural or synthetic materials. There's foam, there's yarns, there are duck feathers, goose feathers, partridge feathers, deer hair, elk hair, moose hair. What are we forgetting? Calf hair, fox, yep, squirrels, rabbits, possum.
Yeah,
basically,
if it has hair.
Anything that has hair, yes, it's a pretty fair game.
It's actually funny that you say that, because my dog is a short-haired dog. He's a Rhodesian Ridgeback, but he sheds quite a bit. So I kind of took a bunch of his hair and mixed it in my, hare's ear kind of dubbing blend that I have going. Mm-hmm. And that was the money fly this weekend. I mean, it just crushed.
Interesting.
So I'm pretty
Did you
happy
check
about
the
that.
regulations where you fished? Because I don't think they allow scented flies there.
Ooh.
Oh, that's
is
interesting. Everything has a scent.
Yeah, but wet dog smell is...
Oh, that's semantics, dude.
I had a guy tell me
So is people fingers.
that's for sure.
No, I didn't check the regulations, but I didn't realize that was a thing. You think that's why they were hitting it?
No,
Dog
I'm
smell?
just messing with you.
Oh, okay. I totally took the bait on that one. Pun intended.
Ray was telling me off camera here that he oftentimes ties his carp flies with Cheetos. He says it doesn't have any effect on the effectiveness of the fly, but they just taste better that way.
They do. I had a guy tell me you had to dip it in skunk juice too one time, and I was like, I don't think that's right.
That'd do it for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you catch catfish that way.
No artificial scent. That's another differentiator for flies, right? No
that's a big
scent
one.
on the fly.
Mm-hmm.
There was a year when I first started fly fishing. We went to the East Coast, like I've mentioned a few times, and we go to South Carolina and fish. And there was a moment where I was getting skunked after 2 days, and I was like, should we just put like some shrimp juice on these things and like stop this madness? Didn't do it, just so everybody knows. Toughed it out, and then, learned to actually catch fish on the beach. So, you got to pay your dues. All right, so those are the materials. And so just so everyone knows, there's my wife calls this like adult arts and crafts, because it kind of is. It is adult arts and crafts, fly tying in general. And we're going to talk more about it at the end of this podcast, or towards the end of the podcast. But just know that, you can buy these things pre-made from factories, or you can tie them yourself. And there is a certain joy that comes with that. It's a rabbit hole, which we'll talk about later, as I mentioned, but it is something that, it's good for people to know, because there's, some people are like, okay, these flies, like, where do I get them? Like, I don't know what's going on. So you can get them from big name stores, like an Orvis, or you can get them from feather merchants, like the one that has employed Mr. Lance Egan here, Umpqua.
Yep.
They take his designs and they have them mass produced, and you can buy them.
Still hand tied, we should mention. All flies are hand tied. There are no machine tied flies, but they're hand tied overseas instead of.
Well, some people tie them with their feet, but yeah, for generally it's hand tied.
Human tied. You like that better? Human tied flies.
I prefer that. Yes.
I'm glad there's clarification there, because there's always one person that's like, oh yeah, what kind of machine ties flies?
It's true. Actually, to be honest with you, I had no idea that was the case. So I'm glad that they're all hand tied.
It's a funny thing in the shop. We get asked that periodically, probably once a month. Somebody will come in that's new to the shop and they'll look at a giant fly selection and go, "Wow, are all of these hand tied?" And you go, "Yeah, every fly on planet Earth is hand tied."
That's crazy. I did not know
these
that.
also qualify.
All right, thanks guys.
You're welcome.
The noob is learning. The noob is learning. So they are all hand tied or foot tied, but you can get them in big name stores, or you can go on Etsy, or you can look on Instagram. There's people that like commercially tie. There's people that tie just independently, and they'll make them for you. Again, it's arts and crafts, so you get to pick and choose what you want. I would say if you're looking for flies, if you don't have a fly shop, the first place I would go is a fly shop. But if you don't have a fly shop, then you can start just searching online, and you'll find fly shops that retail online.
Yeah, I might be partially biased, but I would suggest flyfishfood.com. Ray might suggest a different company. I don't know, but
hey man, I'm down with support fly fish food.
Yeah,
of course you do. But there's also Orvis.com. There's all kinds of places you could buy flies, right?
There are indeed. I called somewhere in Michigan today to buy flies, or at least materials.
There you go.
Cool.
There you go. And flyfishfood.com is a great resource for all things fly fishing. And definitely flies and fly tying materials as well. Mm-hmm. So, and if you live in the Chicago area, I highly suggest you go visit Ray, because they have an entire wall of stuff that you can buy. So, I think we've ticked all the boxes there.
Check.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Let's talk about these flies. We've talked about the different types of fishing. We're going to keep repeating ourselves, because that's the only way you're going to learn this stuff. But there's basically 3 types of flies. Categories, I should say. All the flies kind of fall into these 3 types, and we're going to go through the 3 right now. So the first one would be streamers. So we're actually going to start inside the river. We're doing this for a reason, which I'll explain later, but right now the important thing to know is, what a streamer is. So maybe, Lance, you can describe a streamer for us and give us a little definition there, if you will.
For sure. Yeah, streamer is a type of fly that is most commonly designed to be animated. So a lot of flies you would fish, as we call it, dead drift, at the mercy of the current. Streamers are imitating things like small fish, like crayfish, crustaceans, leeches, things that are going to be able to swim against or across the current rather than just be drifting at the mercy of the current. So streamers tend to be larger flies. They're not all giant, but they're generally speaking quite large. You could use streamers from anything from a trout stream to saltwater. You could use giant bait fish imitations for very large saltwater fish.
Okay, great. And I think it's important to mention that these streamers, they're designed to have an action to them. So they are designed to flex and move and kind of look like they're alive in the water.
Yeah, pulsate, but much like fishing a lure with spinning tackle, right?
Exactly. And it's probably the closest, and we've mentioned this in the previous podcast, but it's probably the closest to traditional spinning gear or, conventional fishing gear.
Right.
You have streamers. What materials are they made from? And I'm guessing, I guess I know, but, I have to prod you here. I have to kind of, my job is to siphon the information from the fishing experts here. So most of the materials that I've noticed, at least like the feathers and stuff, they seem to be bigger. And not always, but you can use bigger sorts of materials on this. So maybe let's talk a little bit about that. And also, now would probably be a good time to kind of dip into this word synthetics. And talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so most materials for streamers are, because we want the streamer to have motion, they tend to be soft, they tend to be pliable, have a lot of movement.
Okay.
So they'd be things like, naming names, marabou, or marabou is a turkey feather that's very soft.
It's turkey. I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. Huh. Things like rabbit fur. You can get stripped rabbit that's rabbit hide that has the rabbit fur on it. When it gets wet, it has a lot of motion to it. Things like bucktail from like a white-tailed deer. The bucktail has kind of I would call it a quivering motion a little bit. It looks alive as you strip it. It condenses a little when you move the fly. It wants to shrink down in size and then expand a bit, kind of like marabou. Less so. The bucktail's stiffer than marabou, but these materials, as they're retrieved, as they're animated, they produce kind of a swimming motion.
Okay.
Could I even add in there too?
It's Ray Ray.
A lot of that stuff, especially like when you talk about bucktails and stuff like that, it also has a water push. Depending on, what kind of fish you're going after, some sort of sonic footprint in the water is a really important thing to have in your flies.
That's a great point.
All predatory fish have, actually all fish have a lateral line. It's literally a line that goes down the side of their body that senses vibrations, and especially, in more turbid off-color water, where fish can't visually locate their prey, they rely heavily on their lateral line at least to get closer so they can either target in that way or just kind of follow the noise or, again, that sonic footprint of the fly, of the bait fish to find their food.
Yeah, I love their record. Sonic Footprint is one of my favorite bands, actually.
There.
Heyo, that's what I'm here for, y'all. Streamers they have a push and pull. And actually, this is something that happens a lot, I think, in conventional tackle, but you can also... There's a bunch of stuff that you can tie into a fly.
Oh, yeah. Like
lead or weights and rattles. That works for the sonic footprint to kind of make them more
audible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, audible and induce a take, as they say. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of part of these newer materials that are coming out too. Is we're kind of being less sacred about what goes on a fly, and things that catch fish are getting added to flies kind of at an exponential rate. Hence, going back to the golden age of fly tying, it's
right.
It's people are experimenting and getting really weird, and it's kind of cool. There is some judgment there from the older fly fishing community, I would assume, or the purists, I guess, is a better way of putting it. But it's cool. It's cool to see where it's taking the sport, I would say. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the old patterns versus the newer patterns, because I think that's something that's kind of cool. It's just going, having said that, it's this thing's evolving. It hasn't stayed where it was, 50 years ago. So what are some kind of classic streamers from way back in the day? And we can put links in the show notes so you guys can kind of see these flies that they're going to mention.
Oh, maybe a gray ghost, a black-nosed dace, a Mickey fin, Matuka-style streamers, or like a spruce fly, spruce streamer.
Okay. Most of those flies were fished swinging, correct?
Yeah, most commonly. I think people still fish some of them today and strip them as well, but swinging was a very common way to fish them for sure.
Cool. I was looking at the Mickey fin because it's just a fly that I saw when I was first getting started, and I didn't realize this, but some people say that it's actually really good in brookie water because it looks like the fin of a brook trout, which I thought was just nuts. I always saw it as some sort of bait fish imitation, but they were saying it looks like it could be the fin of a tiny little brook trout.
I've heard that as well. I've never been able to logically make any sense of that statement. So you're telling me that a fish that is let's say you're catching a above average brookie in most streams. Let's say you catch a 13, 14-inch brookie.
You're
telling me that the Mickey fin is imitating the fin of another fish would be basically bigger than the fish that's trying to eat it?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. That's a little weird.
I don't follow that logic.
That's a little weird.
It's just, I guess if they're just eating chunks of brookies that are coming down the river, that might work. I've heard that as well, though. I've heard that as well. I've never been able to make any sense of it. Maybe somebody smarter than us can make sense of that. To me, the Mickey fin is brookies sometimes really bright colored flies, as do many trout, and I think it's imitating nothing but just piquing their interest because it's moving and it's got bright color. That's the world according to Lance. It very well could be getting eaten as a brook trout fin. I don't believe that's it, but
okay. We like the world according to Lance. Hashtag just ask Lance. By the way, a brookie is a brook trout. It's a type of trout. A very, very beautiful fish.
It's actually not a type of trout. It's a char, technically.
Oh, that's true.
We collectively call them brook trout for some reason, but they are technically a char. They have, they have a dark background with lighter spots, where trout have dark spots on a light background. Does that make sense? Did I say that backwards?
Is that kind of how you differentiate a char from a trout?
A trout from a char. The char, that's not the only way, but char, if you think of all the char family, if you think of lake trout, they're kind of a gray body with lighter spots on it. The brookie has a dark...
Is bull trout a char?
Bull trout's a char, yeah.
Huh, interesting.
As are, obviously, Dolly Varden and Arctic char are no doubt a char.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So brookies, we all call them... I call them brook trout all the time. So it's not really a big deal, but technically they're not a trout.
That's not one of your super pet peeves, then?
No, it's not.
So I don't have to watch myself and be like, oh, I love brook char.
I try most of the time to just call them brookies. because
Okay.
I don't
It
like
solves
calling
the
them
problem.
brook trout because somebody inevitably somebody's going to call you on.
This is cool. I love hearing Lansegan isms that I haven't heard on other podcasts because it's always kind of fun for me.
Those salmon like a bit of the slap and tickle, do they?
Real
I like
fun.
to think that I know where your head's at, and I don't.
I'm not sure I know where my head's at.
Yeah, I've discovered that over time. All right, so we talked a little bit about the classic patterns. Now let's kind of move to the modern pattern. What would you consider some modern streamers? And either of you guys can chime in, obviously.
I mean, you mentioned Game Changer. Although,
Yeah.
would you? Let me ask you this, Lance. Would you qualify Clouser as one of the modern streamers?
That's what I was going to say. I don't know if, Clouser minnows, they're certainly incredibly popular, right? I don't think you could mention streamers without bringing up a Clouser minnow, but I think Clouser minnow, a woolly bugger, that kind of stuff maybe have been around long enough that they're not old school streamers, but they're still very current, very usable. They're not new, if that makes sense.
Sure.
I mean, if Pearl Jam's considered like classic rock now, then I would say Clouser's kind of classic.
Yeah, all right.
They are, for sure. Clouser's been around a long time, but that's just proof of its effectiveness, right? It's been
that's
around,
true.
stayed around for a reason. If a streamer, a lot of today's streamers, I think in 5, 6, 7 years, you won't hear of them anymore. There'll be a few that'll stick, but a lot of the modern streamers will come and go.
Okay, yeah, I think that's probably true. And the Clouser, by the way, if you heard the last podcast when I was talking about my brother catching stripers on the beach in Montauk, the only fly he used was a Clouser minnow, developed by Bob Clouser for the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, right by Harrisburg there. So if you ever cross that bridge, which I just did last weekend, my sister lives out there. It's a huge river. It's kind of nuts to think that that's a place you can just go and fish. It's cool.
Catch some fish. It is a huge place, isn't it?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's like daunting to think about that. But anyways, that's why you got to know structure. Go back to the last podcast if you haven't heard it and learn about structure, because that's a great place where you would have to pick apart the river and find the structure.
Yeah, so some of the more modern streamers are, Gallup patterns. Russ Madden, Tommy Lynch has some patterns that are, larger. I would say that the
Yeah, I love Russ Madden stuff. It's really good.
The streamer craze has... That was incredibly fake.
I know, I was trying to mess with you.
The streamer craze has kind of taken trout streamers to really, really large sizes, and that's kind of what I would call the most modern take on streamers. Not that all of them are, but in our shop, for instance, we sell a lot of Cheech leeches. Some of Cheech Pierce's designs.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about Cheech. Poor Cheech, we left him out of the combo.
Yeah, he deserves it. It's all right. There's all kinds of modern streamers you could check out, but in a perfect world, I think you could get away with a lot easier to tie patterns than a lot of those giant streamers and still catch fish.
But a lot of people find enjoyment in tying them. I mean, I know Ray, you love tying these big ones. And Ray actually ties some really nice streamers.
Mean big articulateds.
Well, and it's like kind of one of those things as the more, materials develop and the more you can do, with shanked flies and stuff like that, you can just get more out of not that a woolly bugger isn't an effective fly, but you can get more out of something that's, it may take an hour to tie. But the realism and the action of the fly, I would say is a lot, more natural, let's say, than a fairly static fly like a Clouser or a woolly bugger.
I also think it depends on what species you're chasing.
100%.
Because, like for instance, Ray tied some flies and he was nice enough to give them to me, and I was chasing pike like 2 weeks ago, and I was in a situation where the pike had followed my fly all the way up to the bank basically, and there wasn't much more stripping I could do, but I just twitched it a little bit, and because there was so much craft fur just like coming off this thing, it just like burped basically, and the thing just annihilated it. You know what I mean? Cool. So I mean that's like awesome. Something you can't really do with a woolly bugger, you know what I mean? So I think that, maybe a trout wouldn't do that, but certainly other species might do that. Even a smallie, smallies are known for like inspecting and like really following that thing and really patiently taking it. So that's something to think about too. And with streamers, I think most people that are chasing non-trout species are fishing streamers, I would say, 95% of the time or something.
Yeah, right.
And then when you get to trout streamer fishing, that's kind of when it becomes like a little bit different. I don't know if you want to put a percentage on how often a streamer is fished, but
It varies angler to angler. I mean, we certainly see anglers that don't fish anything but streamers all the time. I can tell you from just fly sales, streamers are way down the list on numbers of flies sold. Nymphs outsell everything by bazillions.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes
followed
sense.
by dry flies, followed by streamers.
That's a good segue into the next fly because you mentioned it. Let's keep moving down this list here. So another fly that we've mentioned in a previous podcast, and it's one of the 3 categories, is a nymph, and it's also a subsurface fly. So maybe describe what a nymph is again so that they get a refresher on what that was. And now, a word from our sponsors.
From the vise to the boat, to the bank, to those moments you connect to a fish, Loon Outdoors is with you every step of the way, with tools designed at the bench and on the water to help make your best day on the water better.
So nymphs are all subsurface flies, but one of the ways they're differentiated from streamers, which are also subsurface flies, is that streamers are most commonly animated, whether they're swung across the current or you're stripping them in by retrieving line with your hands to make the streamer swim. Nymphs can do that. Wet flies, for instance, you can swing across the current, but most nymphs are meant to be fished dead drift, meaning you're casting them in and they're drifting the same speed as the current you're trying to catch fish in. So nymphs can be both imitative and attractor style. They could imitate very specific insects that live in the river. They could also just be a combination of colors and silhouette and features that really imitate nothing, but pique the interest of the fish enough to induce a strike.
Okay. And I also think it should be added that while there's obviously exceptions to this rule, nymphs tend to be smaller than streamers. If you look at someone's fly box, you'll see, dry flies and you'll see nymphs. They tend to get really little. Also, dry flies tend to get really little, whereas streamers, they're not going to get that little.
Yeah. Nymphs, if you were to add a size range, so for those that aren't familiar with flies, this won't make a lot of sense, but if you were to add a hook size, most of them are, let's say, size 10 or smaller, 10, 12 to maybe 20, 22.
22 is minuscule. It looks like a freckle almost.
What do you think it is? 3 millimeters long?
I don't know. I need to brush up on my metric, but it's super small.
It's very small, and there are exceptions to a giant stonefly nymph or a Helgramite nymph might be a size 2 hook that might be 3 inches long,
right?
Somewhere in there. So the range is large, where the streamer range is more commonly, let's say on the small end of things, a 10 or a 12, and on the large end of things, they could be into the bigger than size 1s, some 1/0s, 2/0s, 3/0s.
Right.
For most trout fishing, they're probably 1 or 2/0 and really smaller than that. But streamers tend to be very large. I like your point there. Most nymph patterns, the best sellers, most commonly used nymphs are probably 12 through 20, 12 through 22, somewhere in there.
And let's talk a little bit about the materials that are used to tie these flies. These words that get thrown around like dubbing and hackle and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so materials, again, could be natural or synthetic. Many nymphs, these days especially, the most popular nymphs tend to be beaded. They're not all beaded, but a lot of the best sellers are beaded flies, so they have a little metal bead attached to the hook that's either tungsten or brass most often, occasionally a glass bead also.
Right, and all those metals and the glass have different weights, so it's depending on how fast you want something to sink, or if you want it to be higher up in the water column, you'll choose a different sort of bead.
Yeah, then we use, like you mentioned, we use a lot of dubbings, which again can be natural or synthetic. They could be furs from animals that you're adding to the hook. They could be synthetic fibers, acrylic, for instance, or nylon type of dubbings.
And if you're looking at a fly right now, you might be like, maybe you just went and bought 4 flies, and the guy at the fly shop was like, these will do, and you don't know which one's the nymph. The one that looks like a little insect, like a little buggy insect that is kind of creepy, is most likely the nymph. And when he's talking about dubbing, it's all that little furry stuff that's tied onto the hook. I'm just trying to simplify it because, I remember I got my first flies and I was like, okay, I got all these flies. Well, what are these things?
Now what? Yeah.
So, sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, that's good. That's all good stuff. So nymphs are, the nymph is a very broad subject. There are just all kinds of them, from tiny little midge larvae and pupa to large stonefly nymphs and everything between, mayflies, caddis. And then there's just the pure attractors. We have a lot of nymphs these days that are tied with bright colored beads or a bright colored tag end on the end of them that's fluorescent orange, fluorescent chartreuse, fluorescent pink. Some that have bright colored bodies, or, there's all kinds of attractor style nymphs that don't look like anything in the river.
True.
Versus, say, there are lots of patterns, like a zebra midge is a very popular midge imitation that looks like a little tiny midge larva, and it's very imitative. It has segmentation, has the right color, has the right silhouette, versus, say, like one of my patterns is called a red dart that has a red tail and a peacock colored body and a brown hackle and a pink thorax and a red thread collar and a gold bead, and there's nothing in the river that looks like that, where the zebra midge is imitating something that is found in the river.
That's right.
The red dart is more of just trying to appeal to the natural curiosity of the fish.
Contrast
is right.
I think it should be added also that you might see in somebody's fly box, if they're a nymph fisher, you might see like little egg style patterns or little worm looking patterns, little grub looking patterns. All those count as what we would call nymphs too, although they're not actually like some sort of nymph, like in the actual scientific term of the stage in the insect's life.
True, yeah, they wouldn't have a complete life cycle. Like a caddis, for instance, has an egg, a larva, a pupa, and an adult. Right? 4 stages, where some insects skip the pupa, only have the larva and the adult. Mayfly. Versus a crustacean, like a scud or a sow-bug, has egg and then what they are. They're a crustacean, so they don't hatch into a winged adult that goes out of the river. Annelids, or aquatic worms, live in the river bottom as well, and they're not hatching in anything. They go from, probably, I don't know enough about them to say, but I would imagine they're an egg, and then they hatch into a tiny worm, and then they grow larger over the course of their life, and eventually
and expire. Then they burrow in your skin, and you turn into a zombie.
No, that's a leech.
That's not true. Okay, cool. Okay. And a leech is usually a streamer, so...
Yeah, there you go.
There we go.
Yeah, but there are all kinds of them, and as you mentioned, you could have stages of each insect. You could have the nymph, or the larva, and the pupa, or an emerger, sometimes that would be called. And then you could also fish any of those stages from the bottom of the river all the way right near below the surface, but right near the surface.
And all this is like very, very deep. And in the beginning, honestly, you don't need to know this to catch fish. So this is just all extra stuff, but it's important to know what the difference is between these flies, because you're going to use them in different situations. So with that, I think that let's talk, you kind of touched upon it a little bit because you mentioned some of the pattern that you developed, actually the red dart, which is a very, very popular pattern and a very deadly pattern. That would be considered a modern style.
True.
Let's talk about what are some of the classics that you might see in someone's fly box that's been fishing, they were fishing 50 years ago. They were fly fishing.
Oh, a prince nymph, a hare's ear, a pheasant tail, a mosier is one that's popular out west. A captain. What can you think of, Ray?
Those are all names of dice games, I think.
I'm a knuckle dragging streamer angler. I don't.
Knuckle dragging streamer angler.
Me throw big thing, hit fish on head.
Yeah, well, pheasant tail and hare's ear. Those are like the two most classic. Okay, well, how about one like a copper john? To me, that seems like an outdated fly. That's kind of like the Pearl Jam of flies now.
It would have come out about the same time as Pearl Jam. I think that's fair. Yeah, that's like a 90s, maybe mid to late 90s type of fly, right? The copper john.
And they're still being used, but they're kind of getting usurped by all these new flies that Lance is tying.
Well, not necessarily just by mine, but they are the copper john for many years, and maybe still is, I don't know, was certainly one of the best-selling flies on planet Earth.
Right.
It's available in lots of colors. To me, the magic in the copper john was that it was very dense. Between the lead wire underbody to create the taper to the fly, the tungsten bead that most of them had, and then the copper wire body. That copper wire is the material that could come in red coated copper wire or green coated or many colors, or there's the original copper john. But you combine lead wire, copper wire, and a tungsten bead, and you have a very dense fly that, to me, the biggest reason that I think that fly was a mega success was just that it sunk faster than most other flies.
Totally. I've thought that before about the copper john, because I've criticized the people that I know that fish it.
It's not an imitative fly. Again, it's a very more attractor style, right?
Yeah.
But it's definitely proven to be effective and has stayed around for a long time. It's a John Barr pattern.
Yeah, and it is a great fly. I've only criticized them because I'm like, oh, you're antiquated, you fish that. But the reality is what ends up happening is a bunch of people fish all the same fly, and then the fish get wise to that, and it kind of becomes like, if a fish sees the same fly every day I don't know. I could be wrong on this, Lance. I know that you have your own opinions on this. But I think eventually they're just like, oh, that's not food. That's that thing that hurt me. So they stop doing that. So, if you start listening to Pearl Jam now, you might be like on the cusp of something new, actually. So if you fish a Copper John now, it might actually work better than it did, towards the end of its
I don't know.
Peak.
Did Pearl Jam hurt you in the 90s when you listened to it?
It certainly did not.
No. And it doesn't today either.
Jeremy's spoken,
In class today.
You mean
in class today? yeah. I don't know how we know that because you can't really understand any of Eddie Vedder's singing. But
that's true. That's true. We need some A$AP Rocky quotes or Bieber in here because, we have a diverse audience.
Bieber?
Yeah, Justin Bieber. Maybe you heard of him. He's had moderate success.
Moderate success. So I would disagree with you on that one because I think that, number one, trout don't have a long memory.
Right. I've heard you say this before.
Number two, most trout live like 3 to 5 years probably. It varies a lot. I'm making a generalization. That varies a lot on the water quality in the fishery, but most of the time. So they're not having like Zoom meetings saying, hey, I ate this red thing that the humans call red Copper John,
right.
and it looks like this. They're not sharing information, right? So, I mean, at best, if you let's say that the fish were smart enough that they wouldn't eat a Copper John, at best you could 3 or 4 years later show it to fish that have never seen it before, and it should still work, right?
Truth. Yeah, I knew that was going to trigger you.
Oh, I'm triggered. Anyway, I feel like flies fall out of favor. They fall out of, certainly even your own patterns, my own patterns. I have flies that I used to use 20 years ago that I caught piles of fish on, and I sell them still, and people still buy tons of them, and they catch piles of fish on them. But in my own fly rotations, I don't use them as much anymore.
Right.
I think things just fall out of favor, and everybody likes new stuff, right? New sells, whether that's flies, whether that's a car, whether that's clothing. Everybody wants new. It looks like you might need a new air conditioner. I don't know.
Yeah. It's rough in here. Well, we can't turn it on. We're recording. That's the problem.
Oh, it's loud. It's a loud air conditioner.
Yeah, it just goes. But that's enough for me to not want it in my recording.
I couldn't hear any of that.
We talked about the classics. We haven't really talked about the modern flies. We did a little bit. We talked about the red dart.
Yep.
Is there something that you can mention a few, but what do you think makes a modern fly modern aside from the fact that it's coming out now, it's got popular now? Has there been any sort of innovation in that world?
There's certainly been some innovation. Yeah, I think the latest, greatest things in nymphs is jig hooks. Slotted tungsten beads and jig hooks are making flies very dense, sink fast, and keep hooks from hanging up on the bottom quite as much. But there's other ways to achieve getting a fly to invert than just using a jig hook and a slotted bead. But anyway, I would say that's one thing that's happened. To me, maybe it's just the little world that I live in, but I would say that very imitative flies are becoming less and less popular, and attractors are growing in popularity. We still sell imitative flies for sure. Yeah. They're very popular, but they're losing ground where it seems like maybe the last, I don't know, as long as I've been in fly fishing, which is, I don't know, close to 30 years now, we've been kind of fed this match the hatch, be imitative. If you just match the hatch, you catch fish, and you will catch some fish doing that. But more recently, people are realizing that does work, but there's also times where not matching the hatch works even better. Just showing something to the fish that piques their interest can often produce a lot more fish and a lot more strikes than having an exact imitation.
Okay, and I was also gonna mention the fact, there's like new materials and stuff that are coming out, and a big one in the nymph world. And the reason that it's gotten big is because typically nymphs, you want them to sink, and you want them to sink fast so they can get into the strike zone where the fish is. But I was thinking of like UV resin, which maybe they didn't have that, like 30 years ago. But it's basically a resin that's cured with the UV light. It's like a black light. That's what it looks like. And it's become pretty ubiquitous in fly tying, and it's seen pretty heavily in a lot of these nymphs, specifically one that comes from Spain called the Perdigon, which has gotten very popular. It was developed in Asturias, Spain, and then spread to Leon, where Mr. Pablo Castropinos, your buddy, is from, and then it's now become a global sensation. I
think we would have different stories on where that originated, but certainly in Spain.
I read an article about it. a Spanish article, so maybe it was wrong. But
I don't know. I don't know that what I know is right either. I'm just saying I have different stories of where perdigons started. They're definitely from Spain.
Okay.
Where in Spain is who knows, right?
Game over.
Yeah, so the UV resin I think is one of those things that's new and it's kind of changed the game in the nymphing world. Would you agree with me on that one?
I would agree totally. Perdigon style flies have really caught on. They are very dense. They're very durable. They get down. They sink very quickly, and the fish like them. So that's a perfect combination.
Okay,
great. It is.
And like I said before, we're going to put some show notes in there, and you'll be able to see what a perdigon looks like, and maybe pick some up and try them out when you're fishing. So let's keep moving on here. We got dry flies as the last one, and I would say we started subsurface. We had streamers, then we have nymphs. Nymphs, they're the ones that kind of, some nymphs are meant to imitate insects, which are like emerging and becoming like adult insects that are winged and fly. So they leave the water, and that's kind of where the dries come in. That's when we start imitating them. And the story that I started this podcast with, I was talking about an elk-hair caddis. That's actually a dry fly, and its job is to kind of sit on the surface of the water. You cast it out, and it just sits there like a fly that's landed on the water, and that's what a dry fly's kind of job is. But maybe you can give me a better definition of what a dry fly actually is.
No, I'm with you. Dry fly is just that. It sits on the surface, right? Dry flies could be aquatic insect imitators. They could be terrestrial insect imitators. They could be, I would even lump, you fished it a little different, but I think we talked about this before, but I would lump like a mouse into kind of a dry fly. It's more of in conventional gear, it'd be more like a wake bait. Huh? It's a fly that's fished on the surface. But yeah, things that imitate grasshoppers, crickets, ants would be more beetles, terrestrials, versus dry flies that are more imitative of aquatic insects would include mayflies, stoneflies, caddis, midges, crane flies, what else? And then you also have, just like in nymphs and streamers for that matter, you also have attractor dry flies. So there are many dry flies that don't imitate anything in particular. I would say the OG dry fly for that is the royal wolf. The royal wolf just has been around for a long, long time. Looks nothing like, well, it doesn't look exactly like anything, right? It could be a green drake. It has kind of two little bumps. Has a body that's similar to maybe an ant type of a fly, but ants don't have tails. They don't have big white wings. They don't often have a different type of segment in them. But anyway, it's one of those flies that probably could be confused by a trout for many things, but really doesn't imitate anything in particular.
That makes sense.
And there's a lot of other patterns that, especially nowadays, that fall into that same category.
Okay, and what kind of materials are we looking for in a dry fly? Because the other two, we were talking about materials, and we didn't mention this, but maybe we should now that, we kind of want materials that are made to sink, right?
True. It's a very good point. Yeah, we failed to mention that. So yeah, sinking materials for streamers and nymphs that are absorbing water, right? Not always, but most of the time, and are allowing the fly to stay subsurface, versus a dry fly, to your point, is often tied with materials that capture air or are very light and would trap the fly in the surface, the meniscus, before it gets, plummets through with the weight and mass of the hook. So most dry fly materials are hollow if they're natural materials like deer hair or elk hair, or hollow fibers that trap air in them. We also use materials that are synthetics like foam or polypropylene yarns that have the ability to have a lot of flotation in them. But dry flies, yeah, you definitely want them to be made of something that will allow it to stay on the surface rather than plummet through and start to sink.
Okay, great. And you mentioned the royal wolf, which we've mentioned in another podcast when I was saying I thought it was from the Catskills and you didn't think it was a Catskill fly. But that kind of could be the launch point for, talking about what's classic dry flies, because dry fly fishing is kind of like, it's like the poster child for fly fishing. When people think of fly fishing, they think of dry fly fishing, and if someone's standing in the river in waders and waving their arm in the air, it's like, that's like the quintessential ad of a fly fisher. Hopefully he's not holding the reel upside down in the ad, but that does happen sometimes. So I think there's like such a history in the dry fly thing, from the UK and all these things. So maybe we can just name a few of the classic dry flies that we find kind of in our boxes, or maybe we don't anymore, but I feel like a lot of these classics are still fished.
Oh yeah, for sure. I would say like there's the royal wolf, for instance, is a classic. Totally. There's all the Catskill style flies that are classics that have feather type wings, fully hackled flies. I would classify elk ear caddis as kind of a classic. Been around a long time. Still very, very popular today.
What about like a parachute Adams? Does that count or no?
Yeah.
Even standard Adams.
Standard Adams, Standard Adams be more classic. Parachute getting a little more modern, right? But it's Standard Adams being 20s type music, and a Parachute Adams being Pearl Jam, and a Chernobyl Ant maybe being, I don't know. Actually, they came out about the same time.
Dubstep.
It's cloud rap.
Yep. Yeah. Maybe the Chernobyl Ant's a little bit more Britney Spears, and
the hippie
something
that's your dubstep.
more like there you go, hippie stomper, or a corn-fed caddis, or what's another really popular current dry fly?
Corn-fed caddis is a Lance Egan pattern.
Yes, that was a shameless plug.
Yeah, and it's a good one.
I'm surprised you still use elk ear caddis. I thought those are long gone.
I just fell in love with it because actually the story behind it's pretty simple. I went to this lake.
I kid, by the way. I kid. They're not long gone.
Okay, well, I fell in love with it because I went to this lake and I was like, how am I going to fish a freaking lake? I have no idea what I'm doing. Went out on this canoe. It was upstate New York. I was like, I'm just going to fish the docks. And I was like, I'm going to try and catch something on dry fly. Cast this elk hair out. It was perfectly placed. I must admit, I was like, oh, wow, I can't believe I just did this. This is amazing. And I'm talking to my niece. She's in the back of the boat, and we're just like chit-chatting, and I look over, and the fly's gone. And I'm like, what? I lift my rod up, and I had this nice smallie on there, and I was like,
fish
what? Yes, I was freaking out. Of course, I lost the fish. But it was my first introduction to like actually catching something on a dry fly, and it just changed my life. So I've always been in love with that pattern, and I find it very easy to tie, which I like.
That is good.
So that's the other reason I like it.
And it's a good classic pattern that's very effective for sure.
Yeah. It has been for me at least. I mean, I got birds eating them.
And those are the home ties too.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a hand-tied African dumb swallow bird that ate that one.
I didn't tell you about the snake that took it? Oh, that's a whole nother story.
Oh, man.
I got caterpillars eating this thing.
If you haven't caught any frogs or toads on it yet, then I don't want to hear about it.
Let's keep moving. So, and then you were talking a little bit about these modern patterns. So, a modern pattern, Chernobyl is a good one. A lot of them use foam, which the Chernobyl does. So,
yeah, the chubby Chernobyl would be one that's really current, I would say. It's been around more than a decade, really, but it's still very popular. It floats really well. It's easy to see. Holds up a dropper really well. Very buoyant. Fish seem to like it. It's got a good silhouette, lots of wiggly legs on there. That's a great, current type of fly. There are lots of more current dry flies that are most current, I would say, are cutting edge stuff right now, and mayflies and caddis are all using CDC, and that's not totally new. That's been used for a long time, but they're gaining popularity rather than losing for sure.
And that, you think that that's coming back around, or do you think that it's just kind of like, I know that like I've seen like Dave McPhail's tie of the, he's got a couple of the CDC mayflies, and I started tying them myself because I like fishing them. And do you think that they used to fish them in the UK and now we're starting to get this, or is it just that it was popular before and now it's becoming popular again?
I mean, we've been using them in the US a long time too. I don't know who started using CDC first. I wouldn't be able to make that comparison, but CDC patterns have been around as long as I've been around in fly fishing. They've certainly just grown in popularity, and as people understand how to use the feathers, and CDC stands for Col de Canard for the noobs out there. It's basically butt of duck is what I just called you.
That's right, you did.
I'm glad you asked. Thank you. Well played.
Yes.
The CDC feathers are basically feathers that surround the gland on a duck that secretes the oil that makes their feathers waterproof. Right. So it's a naturally buoyant feather. They're very soft and they trap a lot of air, and they float really well until they become waterlogged. But they're not stiff, so they're easy for fish to get into their mouth. Where a deer hair or elk hair pattern that would maybe be a little more traditional will certainly take fish, but in my experience anyway, you would miss more fish on that style of fly. Like an elk hair caddis with the stiff elk hair wing and the stiff hackle on it will not, if you're just playing averages, will not land as many fish as a softer CDC style fly.
That makes sense.
Even if you had equal strikes, you're not likely to get as many fish that get the elk hair caddis into their mouth.
Yeah, I also, and maybe it's just because I'm a bad caster, but I feel like the CDC really just floats when it falls. It's just like
it does.
feather-like.
It's very soft. I'm with you.
I mean, I guess it is feathers, but L. catus is also
literally feather light.
Has hair on it, so But yeah, it lands so softly, which is why I've been enjoying it. All right, well, anyways, let's keep moving. We already talked about Catskills. I wanted to do a little bit on regional styles, which we kind of did. One of the big things that I wanted to talk about today also was fly tying, and we've been talking about it a bit intermittently, but
we have.
It's always a question that gets asked, and I think that a lot of noobs, when they start, they're like, well, should I tie flies or should I not? Like, what's the deal with this? Is this something that everybody does? I don't know, And from my experience, I think that there's a big myth about fly tying where people think that it's going to be cheaper if you tie your own flies, which it 100% isn't. One of my goals with what we're talking about right now is to demystify that statement, because
I think it 100% could be.
Really? I don't really think it can be, because in order to tie a bunch of different flies, you need a bunch of different material.
Okay, but that's you passed the where it could be part.
I see.
I would argue. So here's what I tell people on this one. Because people ask this all the time. I work in a fly shop that is incredibly fly tying centric, right?
Yes.
And people come in every single day. People come in wanting to get into fly tying, and we tell them all the same thing. I've never met in my 25 plus years of selling fishing tackle, never met anybody that saved any money tying flies.
Yeah.
So, but I will say that I think it's possible. If you were the type of person that said, I only fish these, let's just throw random numbers, 5 or 10, it doesn't matter. Let's say I'm going to fish these 10 flies for the rest of my life and never change them, never vary them, I think you'd come out ahead.
That's probably true.
I've never met anybody that can do that, because everybody has anybody that has just a touch of imagination and creativity is going to take, let's say they wanted to just fish an L. catus the rest of their life. That's cool, but then when they go to pick up, they run out of dubbing and they go to the dubbing aisle and they're like, oh my gosh, look at this sparkle dubbing.
Right.
I have to have that one. I've never tried a caddis with sparkle dubbing.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, look at that dyed color. I've just been using natural L. for the wing. Now I can get done dyed L. for gray caddis wings.
Yeah.
Mind explosion. And the next thing you know, they have $100,000 worth of fly tying material.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's kind of my point. It's like, especially when you're learning too, you don't know what patterns you like or you don't like. So you don't know if you're only going to fish that one pattern for the rest of your life. You don't know what your confidence flies are yet. So you have to experiment. I mean, when I started fly tying, I bought like all sorts of crazy stuff. I was like tying like this Chilean like saltwater pattern, fishing it for perch. It was crazy. You know what I mean?
I'm 100% with you. I don't think anybody will save money by doing it, but I would highly encourage anybody that's remotely interested in fly tying in taking it up, because as you two both know, it's incredibly fun. It's totally worthwhile. It's a great use of time. It's a great way to unwind. It's also
we're gonna get into I'm gonna cut you off because we're gonna get into the pros.
All right.
I wanted to start with the cons first.
All
I
right.
mean, you know, it's like
so you probably won't save any money.
Okay.
No more tangents.
I have a whole list of cons here for you, and I love fly tying, so the pros definitely outweigh the cons. But
all right, let's hear the rest of these cons.
We got to throw them the nasty stuff first. So it's not cheaper unless you only tie the same 3 flies for the rest of your life,
which you'll never be able to do.
Exactly. It's very time consuming, and you can get fast for sure. But if you're tying, and the other thing that I didn't put in my list, but it's also time consuming because once your friends that don't tie flies figure out that you do, then you become the guy that ties their flies.
You suddenly become better friends.
Yeah. It's
when you start charging your friends for flies.
Yeah, I don't give away flies. That's not good for you.
I do that all the time.
I do too. I'm just teasing.
Oh, okay. And it's like my brother, my sister, 2 of my best friends. They're always fishing my flies. For some reason, they think they're deadly, which is kind of funny. Also,
of course, because they are.
Maybe they are. I mean, a lot of them are your patterns, so I thank you for that.
Then they're deadly for sure.
Oh, for sure. But it is time consuming and it's messy. Also, I think if you have a husband or a wife that is a clean freak, it can be tumultuous, which I do.
That's a clean tying room.
Yeah, that's not bad. Well, he does have stuff everywhere, but
I haven't cleaned off my tying dust.
Lance is showing us on Zoom his tying station.
My wife calls this room this is my hoarders episode in here.
Okay.
You can't see the crates stacked up behind the computer.
That's hilarious. Yeah, it does kind of make a mess, Yeah. I've seen Ray tie some flies, and he's actually pretty clean. I don't know how he does it. He's got the little pouch underneath his Renzetti or whatever. But
well, you see, that's when I tie elsewhere. When I tie at home, my desk has not been cleaned, and it just accumulates the mess of a multitude of different flies.
Yeah, my Roomba basically is just like all dubbing. It's just like sparkle dubbing in the whole thing, but.
I
Anyway,
just find it easiest not to vacuum. Just close the door in my fishing room and don't vacuum this room ever.
It's great. And if you run out of dubbing, you can just pull it off the carpet.
You just get it off the carpet. It's no biggie.
It's messy. And then the other thing is it takes practice. Like you have to kind of work at it. It's, maybe not as crazy as like casting and stuff, but it can be frustrating because you're like, oh, I need this fly to fish tomorrow. And then you're like, well, it's not working out. You kind of have to like learn the pattern a little bit. It doesn't take that much, but.
No, but it is a learned skill. It's not, I think you hit it on the head earlier. We are you'd have a hard time convincing anybody, I think, that we are not in the golden age of fly tying. Between the availability of materials, and then it used to be that everybody had to learn from a book, right? Yeah. Turning a page and seeing pictures of step-by-step instructions. Versus nowadays, you have YouTube, you have fly tying DVDs and videos that you're watching that in real time, watching it happen, and you can pause it and do a step yourself, and then hit play again, and you're watching how people are manipulating the materials instead of just a still photo, or having to know somebody that in your neighborhood or in the general area where you live that's willing to show you techniques. So by simply clicking on the famous interwebs, you can learn all kinds of fly tying techniques. And
YouTube has changed it, and I have a couple fly tying books that I've accumulated over time, and reading them is like, man, I can't believe people are tying flies. Like, there must have been the weirdest flies tied by reading the book. Like, it's so much easier seeing a video.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
And to add to that, I mean, Landsberg's for fly fish food sometimes, and they have some crazy good fly tying videos, and a lot of his patterns, and he's actually tying his own patterns, are on there, and it's just a great way to learn. So if you're like, well, where should I start? I would say start at fly fish food, and we can put maybe a link to a couple beginner patterns there too in the show notes.
Yeah, perfect.
And the last con that I have is that it's arts and crafts. If you're not into arts and crafts, like my brother and my sister, they hate that kind of stuff, and I've tried to get them to tie, and I bring all my stuff on every family vacation. I'm like, hey, how cool would it be if you caught a fish on your own clouser, and like, and they just don't like it. No, they just don't like it.
So I would describe myself as not artsy at all. I have no artistic talent whatsoever. If you ever saw me draw or just try and write my name, you would understand what I'm talking about.
Okay.
But I love fly tying. So I think that it's still a creative outlet that someone that has just a little bit of dexterity, a little bit of fine motor skills and hand-eye coordination can do that. I can literally not. I can't make tolerable stick figures. Okay, I'm that bad at drawing, but I can tie a pretty good fly.
Well, but I think it's a different skill. It's like a lot of people can't paint, but they can play the piano, or it's like
it's 100% a different skill.
Yeah, so that doesn't mean you're not artistic. It just means that maybe you're not like good at visual arts. You know what I mean? Maybe you would be good at sculpture. You just don't know.
No, I've tried.
I mean, you're a good ballet dancer. I mean, that's got to be.
I'm not. I don't dance. I'm bad at ceramics. I'm bad at sculpture. I don't draw. I can't paint.
Okay. Well, you found your gift for sure.
Very bad. Like bad.
Yeah, he can weave a basket like no one else, though.
Nope, no weaving. I tried wood shop, not for me.
Well, I would say, there's people that are just like not into that sort of thing at all. And if you're one of those people, maybe it's not the thing for you.
Right.
Having said that, we should talk about the pros, because there's just so many reasons why it's a good idea to tie your own flies.
Right.
And so I got a list here, and I'm sure you guys will be adding to this, but the first thing is you learn the flies so much more intimately, and you learned why they're designed the way they are, which actually helps you become a better fisher, because you put something on and you use it properly for its intended use, rather than just like, oh, I think this fly works. I mean, take away just like, okay, I just saw a mayfly flying and I'm going to put a pattern that looks like a mayfly. There's other things that are built into these patterns that like make them work a certain way. So maybe you'll cast it differently, or maybe you'll strip it differently. Right. And those are all like these little nuances that you won't pick up on probably unless, you really spend time with the fly and seeing how it's constructed.
Yeah,
so that would be my number one.
I'm with you. And going back to the YouTube stuff, I think it's really cool if you can go back and watch the designer of said fly tie that fly and listen to them talk about the reason they did, use that tail, or the reason they use this hook or that body or what have you. It's going to, just like you said, you nailed that, as far as understanding more about the design of the fly and why you're using those parts and not substituting something else.
Yeah, and it's something that gets overlooked. People think that you just like tie flies to look a certain way, but there's actually more to it than that. And most of these flies that get tied that become popular have been, put through like the fire trial, and there's been multiple iterations of them over the course of years, and they've been fished by multiple skilled anglers, and they've been put, through their paces to
Totally
qualify themselves on, in the pantheon of well-known flies. So,
and any of them that stand the test of time are catching fish, because any old fly that looks pretty cool, has some what we call bin appeal, will sell a few, but if people buy a few and don't catch fish on them, they're not buying more of them.
Truth.
So flies that stay around for a long time are usually proven on the water, as well as tricking would-be anglers into buying them from the bins.
That's right. Thin to win or thin in the bin.
Thin
Truth in the booth.
Unless you want it to be burly.
All right. So, and then, another thing that I was going to say is that, and this just goes like complete opposite, because we're talking like straight pragmatics. And now we're going to talk about straight up philosophy here. We're going to get into that emo stuff that I like, which is there's nothing more satisfying than tying your own fly and then having a fish take that thing. I mean, there is just like the sky opens up and it feels like you just like saw the heavens. It's just the coolest thing, especially in the beginning. But then when you start to get into it, and that's another reason I like sharing my flies, because, when other people appreciate it and they're like, man, I'm catching fish on something that you made. It's such a part of fly fishing that you don't really get that much in conventional angling. I know some people like make their own lures and stuff, but it really is part of kind of like the fabric of the sport.
For sure.
And the history. So it's just it's such a cool, unique feature that comes with this. I mean, it's like, I was like, captain of my soccer team in high school. It's like, I never made my own ball. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, what sports can you do that in? I mean, it's just cool. It's just a cool random thing that we have at our disposal,
I was going down that road before, and then you rudely cut me off. I will try not to dwell on that. But
I'm so sorry.
But that was it. I'm with you 100%. I think one of the coolest things about tying your own flies is catching fish on flies that you tied. That is next level for sure.
It is, and it's hard to explain like in words, but it's like when you do it, there's a feeling. There's like a pride to it, and there's like it's like
you did something right.
Yeah, exactly. It's a confirmation that's a great way of putting it, because it's confirmation that you're not that things are clicking,
right?
Which in fishing is, especially fly fishing, it's hard to get that, and it's those are the things that keep you in the sport. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Keeps you going out, because it's it's an uphill battle for a long time. I think for a lot of us, maybe not if you listen to this podcast, but prior to everyone that had this at their disposal, possibly. The other thing is, and this is kind of a more like maybe black diamond version of a pro, but one thing that you can do is that you can troubleshoot your own flies on the river. So, let's say and maybe it's not black diamond because you just lost all your flies in the tree or snagging, or you broke off fish and you have like one left.
Last resort.
Yeah, it's like you don't have the fly that you need, but
right.
You know that you're seeing these insects, they're hatching, and you know that you need to be fishing this thing. You see fish taking it. You can actually like mess with your fly and kind of roughly try and imitate what you think the fish are taking, so you can mod your own fly in real time on the river to help you catch fish. So it is kind of an advanced play, but it's something that if you've tied the fly yourself, you know exactly how you can make that thing move and turn and mess with it, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
And also if you get a fly that, and this happens sometimes, you have a fish hit a fly a few times, it starts to twist on the hook and all these weird things kind of happen, you'll know how to fix it and put it kind of right and back together the way it's supposed to be, because you know what it's originally supposed to look like.
One thing that I've done, especially with streamer fishing, is I tie a lot of deceiver style flies, and those are designed to ride hook down depending on the current that I fish them in without a keeled weight on the bend of that hook. You get flies that really cartwheel around. So I've even started taking with me like 020, 030 wire, just so I can wrap that around the bend of the hook, so to keel the flies. Or if I want a more erratic kind of twist and flutter with that fly, I can in turn remove that material. That's
sick.
Yeah.
Right.
There you go.
And the other advantage, I think, and maybe you have this down, and I'm getting a little ahead of us here, but
no,
is your ability to adapt at the vise too. So when you're buying flies, you're limited to what is commercially available, color-wise, size-wise, material-wise, and there's thousands and thousands of great flies, and people catch tons of fish on store-bought flies for sure. You know, when a company, like my flies are through Umpqua, and I love Umpqua flies, they do a great job, but let's just use them as an example. They're the largest fly manufacturer on planet Earth, and their standard blue wing olive might be a dead match, but it may be a little darker or a little lighter than the blue wing olives that you see on your local stream. And you could go home and use that same pattern as just your recipe, but as your template, if you will, but then change the dubbing so that it's just a shade lighter, a shade darker, to really more correctly imitate what you're seeing on your local stream. Or maybe you've seen green drakes that are only available in size 10 and 12, and you think that yours are on your river, they're giant, they're size 8s. You could tie your own green drake in a bigger size. Just the adaptability in the nymphing world, especially with the current craze of Euro nymphing. Yeah. When you buy a store-bought tungsten bead, most of them are available with, you buy a 14 hook, it comes with one size bead. Totally. And with tying your own, you could tie a 14 hook with like 4 or 5 different sizes of beads. So you have them in various weights with the same general profile of the fly.
Which is a really common problem. Now my he's gotten tired of waiting for me to tie his flies, and he's wanting to do that, and he's like, I can't get these flies. Actually, a lot of people that sell flies don't even tell you like the weight of the fly or the weight of the bead. They just tell you the size. And he's been having a hard time like knowing what he's buying, and he's trying to learn these weights. He's sure. Getting into Euro nymphing. He's like, I don't understand. I'm trying to figure out like, well, what's the weight of a size 4 bead on like a 14 or 12 hook or something like. And so I told him he should go to an independent tire and ask to have these kind of heavier beads put on smaller hooks, which is kind of becoming more popular now. For sure. And so he was able to do that. But that was because he couldn't buy it in the store. Now, if you tie your own, you can. And that was actually, you said that you didn't know if I had it on the list. And yes, you did usurp my list, and I hate you for it. But it was the next thing that I was going to say, was you can come up with your own custom weights and variations. Nice. Which is, I think, such a great thing. It just makes you way more malleable. We've talked about it with dries and nymphs, but also totally a thing in streamers. You could tie them unweighted in a lightweight and a medium weight and in just a bomb weight, depending on flows and how deep the river is or how fast the river is you're fishing, or even in lakes. You can make them in all kinds of different weights that make a huge difference in the effectiveness of the fly. If you're fishing a streamer that never gets down to where the fish can see it, you're just wasting your time. On the flip side, if you're fishing a streamer that's too heavy and it's constantly snagging the bottom, once again, you're wasting your time. So you can adapt with streamers, nymphs, or dries, all the above. Yeah, and to add to that, a lot of people, they've kind of like made, travel vices to tie flies, and people like travel with their fly tying materials because they want to get to a place, see what's there, and then tie a fly to match what's there in the water to make their chances a little bit higher. And I think one of the cool things about tying your own flies is that you have the ability to do that. Let's say you go to Mexico and you want to fish off the beach, and you're like, well, I don't even know what they're going to take. And then you start looking in the water, you see a bunch of little minnows that are kind of silvery gray. You're like, okay, I can tie a streamer and kind of match those colors. Totally. And the other thing that's really good about it is that you don't have to rely on shipping or store hours if you're in a crunch. Your buddy hits you up like, hey, let's go out tomorrow. And you're like, oh my God, I don't have any flies. Well, guess what? You can take 2-3 hours and tie a bunch of flies, and you're ready to go on the river tomorrow. That was actually the last one I had on the list. And since I'm a procrastinator, that happens to me all the time. Yep, you and me both.
If I can even add one more to your list, and this is maybe a little less with dry flies and nymphs, but some cases too, especially with streamer fishing, there are patterns that just period aren't available. Like a lot of those, we've talked about game changers. Yes, there are companies that make them, but not in all the variations. And sometimes, it's you just have the flexibility to go online and find a recipe for a fly that's not commercially available, and you have that at your fingertips there.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Or even just come up with your own pattern, which we kind of did cover, but I mean,
that's a whole nother thing that's just really cool if you can start kind of going in your own route and messing with things. And I mean, I do that in the kitchen all the time. Yeah. And my wife makes fun of me. She's like,
can't you just follow a recipe?
I'm like, nah, I can't.
That's boring.
You always got to do something, add your own touch to it.
Exactly. And I tend to do it with all my flies too, because I don't know, it becomes my own even more, I guess, when I do that. So that's another perk, I think.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think that's part of also growing as an angler is you start to learn like what would work and what wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing about fly tying that it really helps, because you've tied all these flies and you kind of learn, what works and what part of the fly is important, like what you can't really change and what you can kind of swap out. Mm-hmm. It just, again, makes you intimately know your tools much better is the point.
Yeah,
for sure.
That kind of sums up, I think, the entire fly episode. We're going to start digging in deeper in future podcasts. We're going to talk a bit about matching the hatch, and then we're also going to talk about deciding what fly to use when. We talked a bit about it today, but we're going to do like deep dives on each style of fishing: dries, nymphs, and streamers, and each one will get its own podcast, and we'll really kind of do a deep dive on that style. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. This is the Noob and the Knower podcast, and today we talked all about flies, what flies to use, when to use them, should you get into fly tying, or should you not, and we hope that you've enjoyed the show tonight. Please tune in for the next episode. It's been great, guys.
It has indeed.
Lots of fun.
We're signing off here. Take it easy, Lance. Take it easy, Ray, and bye-bye to my dog, Sebastian.
Peace.
Adios, Sebastian.
Later, y'all.
See ya.
This was a Raul Maria production.
Except for the GT Caddis.
I watched the video, bro.